Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the General Eclectic podcast with Rod Dreer. I'm your host, Kale Zeldin, and we have a special episode today for number 39. Rod, how you doing over there?
I'm doing well. I'm here in Louisiana with America's greatest integralist, Ignatius Riley. And
no.
I wanted to interview him today, but instead we have Ross Douthat.
We can get what we get. So
we get. We're having Ross on because he's just published his latest book called The Deep Places. It's just an absolutely extraordinary book. It's about his 6-year struggle with Lyme disease, but it's about so much more than that. And we'll be talking about that this hour. Ross, thanks for joining us.
It's really a pleasure, Rod, and I'm here to correct your geometry and your theology. So hopefully I can substitute for poor lost Ignatius on the show.
Yeah, he's going to be vending hot dogs in the Empire of Guadalupe. Anyway, when I saw you about 6 or 7 years ago, I forget where it was at some conference we were both going to be at. You walked in and you looked horrible. I didn't know what was wrong with you, but I praised you for your weight loss because I'm always, looking for the good side. But you said it wasn't a good thing. You had lost weight because you were really sick. Now, I can't remember whether you knew at that point you had Lyme or not, but can you give our listeners a sense of just how sick you were?
Yeah, so that would have been, I guess, late July or early August of the first summer when I got sick. Was that in Nashville?
I think it was Nashville. Yeah.
Yeah. No, that was one of the only events that I did that summer. Actually, the other one was at a obscure Catholic boarding school in none other than Rhode Island, the state of Rhode Island. That was that. So in fact, I had close encounters in some sense with both of you during that first summer. But yeah, at that point, I didn't know what was going on. I probably told you that I had some sort of nervous disorder or nervous breakdown or something like that. But basically, my wife and I, and then our two girls, had this sort of fantastical plan to move back to the state we were from and live in the country. I know you can't relate to that kind of thing at all.
It's always
Rod.
A bad idea, Ross.
It was, I've only got, this is the first book I've gotten out of it. I've heard that you can get 2 books out of it if you work it right. But yeah, we basically did the Connecticut more secular version of the Benedict option. We bought a house in the country with a barn and a pasture, and we had all these plans to raise chickens and garden, all terrible ideas basically. And
yeah, I got chickens.
Pretty much a week after we did the inspection on the house, so we were sort of into the house. We had bought it. We had set closing dates. I first had sort of a red swelling on my neck, and then I had headaches and weird neck pain. And then a few weeks later, I had this sort of full body meltdown where nothing worked. I was, my heart was racing. I had, my bowels liquefied. I felt like I was vibrating at some bizarre frequency. And this sort of set in motion this whole summer of going to 10 to 15 different doctors, taking every kind of test, and being unable to figure out what was wrong with me, to the point where when you saw me, Rod, I had lost 40 pounds, was sleeping a couple hours a night tops. I think at that event, it was one of the only ones I dragged myself to. I remember sitting, I'm not sure who, it was one of these conferences where I was supposed to be talking about American Christianity or something. And I was afraid that I was going to have a phantom heart attack, probably right there on the Nashville hotel stage.
Well, as you say in the book, you had them. You had
yes, I went to. Well, I mean, yeah, I went to. Well, I guess I should say I was having a phantom heart attack and was afraid I was having a real one because I had as the situation got worse, I had terrible chest pain in what I think I now recognize was just literally in my pectoral muscles. But if you have really bad pain in your pectoral muscles, you go to the emergency room and think you're having a heart attack. So I did that several times. I did many things, and it was only when we somehow dragged ourselves to our unhappy dream house in Connecticut that I started seeing doctors who suggested that I probably had acquired Lyme disease, and most likely literally walking the overgrown grounds of our dream country house, on the day we were deciding to buy it.
You're doing quite a closing.
That was sort of the opening act of the story that's in this book. So you were there at the very beginning.
Yeah, and I remember when you told me on email that you think you had Lyme disease and you think you were bitten by a tick on just walking through the property. That's when the story takes on almost the shape of a myth.
Yeah.
And that's one of the reasons I think this book is going to appeal to people who may have no interest in Lyme disease themselves, but this is a myth about what happens when people are flying high and they fly too close to the sun and boom. Can you talk a little bit about that, about the because you do in the book, but you talk about this as almost a form of punishment for hubris when you actually hadn't done anything wrong. Let me get that clear. But
well, I mean, haven't we all done something? Right.
Yeah.
The heart of man is evil from his youth, Rod. But yeah, I mean, no, it felt entirely like hubris meeting nemesis. We didn't literally build wings out of wax and try to fly to the sun, but we did have this fantasy of rural life, and things were going very well professionally for both me and my wife. We had 2 beautiful kids. Literally, my wife found out she was pregnant with our 3rd child the day that I first found the swelling on my neck. And we sold our house in DC for this, the DC housing market was ridiculous. We sold it for this outrageous sum relative to even what we expected. And instead of taking that money and giving it to the poor or stewarding it wisely for future generations, donating it to the Walker Percy Festival, and instead of doing something worthwhile with it, we went out there and bought this spread of land and had this plan. And it was a mix of sort of hubris in what we were going to do, the idea that we were going to live this sort of pseudo gentleman farmer life, and also maybe a kind of like sort of an idea of getting, I think you would relate to this, Rod, in certain ways, like getting away from the corruptions of the city, right? And saying, oh, we're gonna go somewhere where things are simpler. I'll play in the local softball team. Our kids will just go to the local public school. We won't have to worry about these sort of, back then it was just ruthless, cutthroat public school competition, private school competition you worried about. And sort of leave the corrupt metropolis behind for the virtues of the country. And I especially, but obviously my wife got to share this experience as well. We were educated in certain realities, and it's hard not to see it as a kind of chastisement. You obviously don't want to sort of overread what God intends in any particular situation, but when you're in it, when your pain is at your worst, and I should say basically, so what happens is we get there, I figure out I probably have Lyme disease, I start treating it, I stabilize, I stop going to the emergency room all the time, but I don't get better. And so then there's several years in this, beautiful rural retreat that is now terrifying because we don't want the kids to go in the fields, right? There's a couple of years of sort of trying to figure out just how to treat myself, find doctors who can help me. And that's the part that's, the comparison to a Stephen King novel, I think, sort of apt.
I was just going to say, it reminds me of the opening beats of something like Pet Sematary. It's like, which I think is the exact storyline. You have this couple with a young child who leave and go. No, I was thinking the exact same thing.
That's a terrifying book.
Yeah, it is. It is.
I thought, our touchstone, because we were both writers in the situation, is The Shining, right? You're in this, and especially for my wife, you're in this situation with your husband and your kids where you love your husband and you're trying to help him, but you're also not sure, should you be trying to protect yourself from his craziness? I mean, as you get into this, the reality is that because Lyme disease is hotly contested, there are all these arguments about, does the chronic form of Lyme disease exist? Is it psychosomatic? If it does exist, how do you treat it? There's never a moment when you can say with absolute certainty, okay, my husband, he knows what he's doing. He's got his sickness under control.
And it hits right in the zones of, one wants to be reasonable, one wants to be, follow the science, one wants to do all of these things, and yet we find these things like Lyme, which seem to fit almost perfectly between the cracks of what we know and what we refuse to admit that we don't know, in terms of medicine and the science. That's what, because I have some experience with this as well. And it's just like, there's nothing more daunting than when something real, something feels really real, and yet the doctor's looking at you like you're the crazy person over and over and over again.
And not just your doctor, other people around you. I have a little experience with a very minor version compared to what Ross went through. But when people don't believe you, they think, are you sure this isn't in your head? Because the doctors can't find anything. What did all this teach you about follow the science, Ross?
Well, there's sort of two levels, right? The first level is, on the first level, I felt like I actually was following the science, in the sense that, you do a lot of sort of, what do we say on the internet now? I did a lot of my own research, guys. I did the research. And, that phrase has certain conspiratorial connotations. But in fact, I did do the research. I read everything that I could read on Lyme disease. And the conclusion that I came to, that I think is the correct conclusion, is that, this sort of official narrative that's really skeptical of chronic Lyme disease is wrong. There's plenty of solid evidence that Lyme in its chronic form is real, that Lyme can persist in spite of short courses of antibiotics. And the challenge is that the doctors who are trying to treat it just don't have a simple one-size-fits-all solution. So the reason the consensus persists is not that there is sort of definite evidence that chronic Lyme patients aren't really sick. There's plenty of evidence that they're sick. It's just that since the people trying to treat them don't know for sure how to get them better, they can't overthrow the paradigm. They can't say, look, we're diagnosing this and we can treat it, right? So you end up having to basically become your own doctor to a certain extent. You have, I had some really good doctors to help me, but you also sort of just have to conduct experiments on your own body, which is itself a form of science. You just have, your sample size is really small. It's just you. But it's not that part of it is not, that part of the story is not about the limits of science. It's about how sometimes doing real science requires stepping outside the existing sort of safe consensus rules, because those rules get a lot of things right, but they also have their limits. Then there's also, some weirder stuff in the book that really is on the borderline.
Oh, I'm so waiting to get to that.
The borderlands, right. Well, we can, So I really tried in the book, successfully or not, as for the reader to judge, to sort of, there's some basic medical realities about chronic Lyme that I would like to convince people are true, independent of what they think of some of the weirder stuff I did. And so I literally put some of the weirder stuff in its own chapter and say, look, I want to persuade you that taking antibiotics for a couple of years can be a really good idea for Lyme disease. And if you're persuaded of that, great. And through this door over here, there's some weirder stuff, and you can go through that door or not if you want to or not.
Well, I can't wait to get to the weirder stuff, but I want to talk about some non-weird stuff before we do. One of the things that I found so interesting about your narrative was your reflections on privilege, on how your own privilege as, Harvard educated, member of the professional class, and so on and so forth, plus coming out of that social class too. So you could turn to family members for financial help and other help, Plus, you yourself, if you hadn't been a well-educated person, perhaps you would not have been willing to bury yourself in research. You might have just passively accepted it.
Yeah, no, I mean, this is one thing that sort of horrifies me, and it wasn't something that you really focused on when you were when I was at my sickest, right? Because when you're at your sickest, you can't imagine anything worse than what you yourself are going through, and the idea that you're somehow privileged is not really an important part of your consciousness at that moment. But as I got better, the awareness of just how fortunate I was to have all of the advantages that you listed and more, to be a journalist, someone comfortable using the internet, someone confident enough in their dealings with doctors to, go from doctor to doctor, to challenge doctors, to, all of these things come with being a, upper middle class meritocrat, basically. Yeah. And when I try to imagine going through my experience as someone without those advantages, it's just, I mean, as dark as my own story sometimes is, that idea is just much, much darker. And I would say, it's the experience has really changed my own perspective on something that, all of us in punditry now write about a lot, right? Which is sort of the rise of opioid abuse and sort of so-called deaths of despair among the American working class. And, it's not that I now think that everyone in Appalachia has Lyme disease,
right.
Though I do think there are probably a number of undiagnosed cases of Lyme disease in the rural Midwest. But it's more that just being in chronic pain and not knowing how to deal with it is hard enough when you have every advantage in the world. And it's not at all surprising to me that in an age when there are various factors, and we don't even begin to understand them all, causing chronic pain and chronic illness in modern society, that people who have that happen, who are downscale, less educated, struggling economically to begin with, can just be lost. You just get carried away into a kind of darkness. It's really easy for me to imagine that happening, because there were ways in which it almost happened to me.
Did it change your view at all on policy? How we should do a medical policy for sickness, socialized medicine, anything like that?
So that's a really good question, and I've been thinking about. I didn't write about that in the book. When I first got sick, and then I thought I could get better quickly. Back then, that was sort of the first thing I had in mind. I was like, oh, I'll use this to illuminate policy debates, and then when you're sicker for longer, other aspects of the story come to seem more interesting. But I'm not sure, because the challenge is, on the one hand, right, everything about my experience, the privileges we were just talking about, right? One of the privileges I had was the privilege to pay to see doctors who wouldn't take insurance. Or at one point when I needed or wanted to try doing intravenous antibiotics, to literally take money from my father, because this was ridiculously expensive and I needed his help, right? So in that sense, you can read the book as kind of an argument for socialized medicine. And I definitely think it makes a case that I've shifted towards, and I think not all, but some people on the right have shifted towards as well, which is just the sort of sheer bewildering complexity of the medical system makes the right-wing idea of the patient as consumer seem, really, really hard to imagine working out that well. And certainly there was no point in my quest for a cure when I behaved like a rational consumer. It was like any test I could get, I wanted that test. Any pill a doctor was willing to try, I wanted that pill. There was no weighing of financial costs or benefits, as there would have been had I not had the resources that I had. But
I wonder.
But here's then the twist, right? Which is that if you had socialized medicine,
even worse.
Well, you would have some kind of central bureaucratic body saying, here are the treatments that work for Lyme disease, here are the treatments that don't, and everything that I did, not everything, but many of the things I did would have been outside the socialized system.
Right.
And indeed, there are Lyme patients in Canada, I know, who say actually Lyme treatment is much worse in Canada because the medical authorities have more power to determine what gets paid for. So that, in that sense, it cuts the opposite way, because the kinds of treatments I was doing weren't just expensive, they were sufficiently outside the consensus that a socialist system would disfavor them in other ways, even if it was paying for certain procedures more generously.
Yeah, in my family's experience with chronic illness, which included chronic pain, our issue is we had plenty of access to healthcare. The problem is that the quality of the healthcare just could not withstand what I'm calling edge cases or crack cases, things that fall between, like you said, the tests that we have available medically are great at testing for the one thing that the test is designed to indicate. And if you have something that is adjacent to that or slightly to the left or the right of it, the test is not going to pick it up. So you mentioned, at one point you had like one band on the Lyme, disease. And so the tests themselves are, it's like dealing with a program. The program does exactly what you tell the program to do. But if you need information that falls outside the parameters of the program, it doesn't matter how much access you have to healthcare, because it's not going to pay for them. And we spent our fortune, whatever it was, on trying to get to the bottom of our particular medical mystery, and it was never really solved.
Well, and this is one of the things that I find fascinating about your account, Ross, is that toward the end you talk about how disruptive your experience is to the idea that many of us have of the body as a machine, as a biological machine. In fact, you say it's more like an ecosystem. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, I mean, this is something that I think people know intellectually. Like at this point, people know that our guts are filled with with bacteria, and there's microorganisms crawling all over your skin. Like people have a sort of intellectual awareness of this. But I think still the instinctive model, both of how people think about the body and especially how modern medicine tries to treat illness, is to imagine that your body is a fortress and you're trying to keep bad things out, and if they get in, then the job of medicine is to treat and kill them, and then rebuild the walls again. And that is, I don't even want to say that idea is bad, because I did rely on that idea. Like I talk a bit in the book about how I really did think about my treatment once I figured out things that seemed to work as a war, right? As this campaign where you're trying to rid yourself of an invading enemy by any means necessary. So I sort of thought in those terms too. But there is just this zone of real ambiguity that's really important to understanding a lot of different chronic illnesses, I'm convinced, where people get things in their body, their immune system deals with them, but they aren't gone. And, I mean, obviously, Rod, like with your experiences with mono and Epstein-Barr, right? That's sort of a classic case study where presumably you have a virus living in your body at all times. And under periods of stress, your immune system weakens and the virus comes out, and then your immune system flares to try and kill it, right? And there's probably never going to be anything that you can do to make that virus go away entirely, but you can live, I mean, you can imagine a world where your life becomes stress-free and your body just deals with the virus, right? But it's just very strange to think of. And part of what happens with infections like Lyme too, is they come in, they suppress the immune system, and then other things flare up. So lots of people who get Lyme will have things like Epstein-Barr flare up too, that their body had previously suppressed, or shingles, right? Like I've known people with Lyme who ended in terrible cases of shingles, because shingles is a virus that you suppress, and then Lyme shuts down your immune system. Guess what? There it is. It's just sort of fascinating to think of your body in those terms, at any given moment, there's a lot going on, and a lot being sort of, there's a lot of stuff living in your body comfortably, not causing you any trouble, but ready to cause you trouble at a moment's notice.
Well, it sounds like it almost sort of changes one's conception of what you think of as your body. And this, I wonder if this has sort of made you rethink Charles Taylor's, the myth of the buffered self versus the porous self. We sort of lived under this idea that, we have this sort of I mean, I know it's a little bit of a metaphor here, but I wonder if that sort of altered the way you think about the body, Ross.
Yeah, I sort of steal from Taylor a little bit, and of course he's talking more about the soul and the psyche, right? He's got the idea that in the modern world, we stopped thinking of ourselves as being permeable to ghosts,
spirits, and
demons,
ghosts.
spirits, astrological influence, although that's back on the menu now for the Zoomers. But but there's sort of a parallel there, I think, between how the modern world encouraged us to think of our bodies as not impermeable, but something where you're trying to basically, things are either in or they're out. There isn't this sort of in between zone. And there are ways, in which, like, certain kinds of illness, there's overlap between those categories, in the sense that certain kinds of illness, while they are not the same thing, obviously, as a demonic possession, they feel like you are being possessed in some sense. Like they're like having a certain kinds of infections run free in your body. It does feel like some alien force is taking you over. And in the book, I talk about one of your favorite plays, Rod, the Heroes of the Fourth Turning play that was such a big thing for Catholic conservatives.
Will Arbery,
right,
sorry.
Will Arbery. Yes, Will Arbery's. And there's a character in it with chronic Lyme disease, and at a certain point late in the play, she has this sort of outburst that everyone ends up arguing about, what does it mean? And I don't actually know what it means in the context of the play, but seeing that play as someone with Lyme disease, watching a character with Lyme disease on the stage, you recognize this feeling of like toxic pollution in your body, sort of overspilling, that's thankfully less intelligently malign than an actual demon might be, but is a like malignant invasion nonetheless.
One of the things that I found, and you told me I would when you were writing this, I'd find most interesting, is the intersection of your medical story with the mystical, with the woo-woo, with the, I mean, you have in there signs that are things that could be read as signs, the deer that appear, the mysterious meeting in an airport with a monk, and the dreams you had, the sand dollar, etc. Can you tell me how this experience affected the way you read the world symbolically, if that's really what I mean, and also generally about how it changed your view of God, your relationship with God?
Well, it made me a lot more scared of him.
Yeah.
I mean, at some level, right? Like that's, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. So now I got a little bit of wisdom, right? Like a little bit of healthy fear. But I think one thing I realized, so I'll go backwards from that to the symbolic stuff. But one thing I realized through this experience is that, for a lot of my professional life, when I wrote about American Christianity or American religion, I spent a lot of time critiquing this kind of, gospel of health and wealth, or the God within, this stuff that is in Joel Osteen. It's in Eat, Pray, Love. The book I wrote, Bad Religion, is full of sort of theological critiques of that perspective. But I totally believed in that kind of God for myself at some level before this happened.
Yeah.
I would never have said so, right? It was all sort of subconscious, I guess. But I thought, and it's not even that I thought I was a good person exactly. It was more just that I thought, I'm doing well, and I am sort of mastering the world in which I find myself. And that shows that I am, working with God's intentions for my life. And the fact that we, got to live our dream and move to the country was just one more example of this. So I was an Osteenian And now I have entered, now I have been in the Old Testament, and I've seen, I've seen the truth. So that's one shift. And then, yeah, I mean, the symbolic stuff, as with interpreting an illness itself, the kind of symbolic things that seem to happen to you in the course of an illness, right? Like various encounters and moments, and you're having this moment on the beach in sort of agonizing pain, where I've always used like finding a sand dollar as this kind of symbol of divine providence, even though I'd never in my life found a sand dollar. In this moment of like maximal agony, there's the sand dollar in between my feet. Those kind of moments from the outside, I think you can say, well, Douthat, in his in his suffering, started looking around for symbols, looking around for signs that God still cared. And naturally, because we're pattern-seeking creatures, he found them, and good for him, but it doesn't tell you anything about whether God actually exists. And that's an okay reading, I guess, of things. But when you're in it, it actually feels really heavy-handed.
No,
it's sort of the opposite of like you're parsing things for signs. It's like, no, thump. It's like here's God's hammer, and it's not, or it's like a wink, right? Like the sand dollar didn't heal me. It didn't like take away my pain. It was more like God being like, yeah, I'm here. I'm here. I'm sorry for what you're going through. It's not going to stop anytime soon, but here's what you need to get through it. But it didn't feel like I was, parsing my experience to find the sign. It was more like when there seemed to be signs, they were like mallets hitting me on the head.
But I think that it is actually a bad reading, the secular reading that you're talking about, because, and this is what my next book is going to be about. It's about how these things happen. They do happen to us, and they can tell us something about the way the world is. But that maybe you don't want to go into that tonight.
Well, no, I mean, that's what I mean, that I have made my own version of that argument, and I'm looking forward to your book. And yes, I think fundamentally that's correct. I'm just sort of trying to I try throughout the writing of this book to put myself in the shoes of the more skeptical reader. But no, I mean, these were, again, they weren't mystical experiences. That's what's part of what's interesting. My mother is a very mystical personality. I know a lot of people who are very mystical, who have sort of, numinous seeming experiences. And my experiences were much more prosaic. I would, like the sand dollar is just a thing, right? It's not like the heavens opening and you see the oneness of the universe. It's just like a thing on the ground. And similarly, to the extent that I got things out of prayer or confession, they were very physical reactions, like seeming to, have something happen in my body. But that itself is, it's, well, that itself is interesting too. It's sort of the mysticism of the physical world, if you will.
Yeah, but it happened to you in church once. You tell this story about how you reached out in prayer and agony, and then something happened right there. You fell on the ground, was it, and were thrashing or something, or you were going
I was a little more under control than that, I guess. I don't want to overdo it, but yeah, so one thing that happens with Lyme disease is you get these things called Herxheimer reactions, where when you get a large number of bacteria dying off in your bloodstream, people can get various forms of this. Some people just get like flu-like symptoms. For me, it was always sort of weird rubbing and itching and a desire to sort of move my arms and legs. And yeah, I got that. I figured I would get it from taking large doses of antibiotics. Basically, that's sort of the normal, rational way to get it. And in this case, a few years into my illness, I got it after confession, and I, sort of staggered from it was a mostly empty church, fortunately, but it didn't stop. I had to keep moving my arms and legs, so I sort of made my way to a staircase up to the choir loft and sort of stayed there. And it died down. And when it finally finished dying down, the mass had started and the first reading was the book of Job. And again, it's like, wham, goes the mallet.
Yeah, I'm literally thinking of Job as you're talking. I didn't know that story. So, yeah.
Yeah. So that's sometimes God is subtle and sometimes he's enjoys being obvious, I think.
Well, I sort of wonder, I wonder if God's subtlety is sort of a limitation of our own willingness to see in the thin spaces or something. I don't know. I think a lot about this, that God's actually not subtle. It's us. It's we that are numbed in some way.
We weirdos.
Well, this is right. Well,
that's what I mean.
This is the question, and you will have to take this up in your book, Rod. But one of my questions about the Charles Taylor thesis, right? This idea that we have sort of put up these walls, right? And I sort of go back and forth on this. Sometimes I think, yes, we've put up these walls, and so we no longer have these kind of experiences that were more commonplace in medieval Christendom or something, right? But if you actually read about weird happenings or just talk to your fellow human beings in a sort of way that makes it clear that you're open to hearing about their weird experiences, people have what would have been understood as supernatural experiences all the time in a disenchanted modern world, and secular people have them all the time. It's not like an everyday thing, and there are plenty of people who feel like they go through their secular existence being secular and not having them. I don't want to overstate it, but it's not like this. It's not like those experiences have disappeared at all. It's just, as a culture, we've changed our way of reading them and interpreting them. Anyway, that's sort of the alternative to the Taylor hypothesis, right? It's not that we've put up walls; it's that we've changed our sort of intellectual reaction,
and almost like our sensitivity to such things. Like we can, I don't know. I agree. I don't actually think that it's an inversion of Taylor's model. I think it's sort of coming at Taylor's model by way of the weird hypothesis, that the weird, it's this thing that's allowed us to be incredibly wealthy and sophisticated in all these sorts of ways, leaves us, oddly vulnerable in these strange ways to these phenomena.
Yeah. Well, it leaves us, that vulnerability then too is the other question, right? Which is sort of like, what if these experiences are all out there? What happens to the society that loses faith in both Christianity and secularism, right? So you have, the stories about requests for exorcism going up over the last 20 years are sort of, little indicators of how the disenchanted world. I mean, there's danger in reenchantment, I guess, is what I'm saying, right? Like the disenchanted world is it's
controllable.
It's controllable, and it's
gameable.
It's gameable, but it's also like I'd rather live in it than in a world of just sort of demonically haunted all the time, right? Like that's.
Well, I don't want to be all trite or not trite. I don't want to be pithy about it, but I mean, look at libs of TikTok or something like that, and tell me that we don't live in a possessed age. I mean, the kids are not all right. If you spend enough time on social media, it is breaking down. And it's also breaking down in this sort of this transhuman sort of way in which we interact with our devices. It's like the spirits have gone electric. It's like Dylan at Newport or something. It's like this. It's wild. I don't know. I think it's wilder than.
Well, fortunately, none of us will be alive long enough to see how it actually plays.
I don't know, man. I'm not that old. I'm not that old, Ross.
I feel a lot older since having this experience. I feel like I've jumped ahead a little bit.
Yeah.
Before we back off Charles Taylor, as we're winding down here, I just want to say that I read the book as a message. One way to read it is a message to an America whose faith in science and technology
Yeah.
and our wealth and our own goodness serves to buffer ourselves from the experience of suffering. But you say, Ross, and this is one of the most poignant parts of the book, about how when you entered into this underworld of chronic illness, you were shocked by how many people out there who seem outwardly like they have it all together really don't. Is that a fair reading to say that you're trying to say, no, it's not what you think it is, where the buffered, the things that we've brought into our lives in this secular age to buffer ourselves really aren't true?
Yeah, I'd say that's sort of it's sort of a tension within my own analysis, where on the one hand, some of the buffering works, right? Like you really do have, people live longer than they used to. They don't die of horrifying toothaches, and I mean, children don't die in infancy. Like there clearly are ways in which we have successfully reduced certain forms of suffering in a profound way, and in a way that, when you actually suffer, you you are grateful that these other forms of suffering have diminished. At the same time, that it's that coexists with the reality that suffering still comes for people in larger numbers than you would think from, maybe not on libs of TikTok, but going on social media, turning on the TV, interacting in the sort of more banal spaces of everyday life. And it really was surprising to me, once when I was doing things like, even, when I was I had a lot of experiences like the trip to Tennessee where I saw you, Rod, where I would see people who I didn't know as well as I knew you, and I would have the filter off, and they'd say, how are you doing? And I'd say, well, I'm horribly sick. Thank you for asking. And that, sometimes people didn't know what to do with that, but quite often it was sort of like a door opened for them, and they would say, well, yeah, I've been, I have this terrible problem and I've been going to the Mayo Clinic to try and get it treated for the last 2 years, or I turned to acupuncture to, deal with my horrible back pain, or, or I mean, in the Northeast, it was literally often like, oh, you have chronic Lyme disease. My sister was sick for 7 years with that. Right. So like, that's, you don't have to reconcile those two things. They can both be true at once, right? That we have this sort of world that has excluded certain forms of suffering successfully, and yet there is not actually a full escape from suffering.
Right.
But those two things are both going on. So I'm not, I guess to sort of answer your question, I'm not sure whether I'm saying, oh, modern America, you need to recognize, you need to experience suffering to learn from it, and you're not experiencing enough suffering, or whether I'm saying, hey, modern America, there's tons of suffering still going on and you're not realizing it, and it can be both at once, I guess.
Tell us about the crazy machine. Is it the Rife Machine? Is that how you say it?
Yes.
This is chapter 7, you try to be careful with your reader and say,
you don't have to read
trigger warnings.
Yeah, that's right. Right.
Yes. So the Rife Machine is just it's a simple little box that generates sound waves that are alleged to shatter bacteria in the way that a soprano hitting a certain high note shatters a glass. And it's crank medicine, basically. It's something that you can actually, I should say, find some interesting studies that support the idea that in some way sound waves could affect bacteria, but no reputable doctor or scientist would endorse the use of this machine, where you turn it on and you hold these two handles that have wires running into the machine, and the waves are supposed to go through your body.
But for you, it worked.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's the thing, right? It's right. Yeah. I mean, well, yeah, no, as I said, no reputable scientist would endorse this. But it very clearly worked. It wasn't even like a question. It had the same effect as taking a strong dose of antibiotics. And there are the reason I used it is because there are lots of Lyme patients, and not only Lyme disease patients, but they are this sort of uniquely desperate population who have been using it for many years. And in fact, it shows up, one of the best pieces about chronic Lyme in a mainstream magazine in the last 10 years was a story called The Lyme Wars in the New Yorker by Michael Spector. And the first case study in that piece, the first person he's writing about, is a young woman who, you know, had Lyme disease, took antibiotics, didn't get better, treated herself with stronger and stronger antibiotics for years, and finally figured out how to suppress the disease using a combination of drugs, dietary changes, and a Rife machine. So, and that's, again, she doesn't, in the story, she says the same thing that I'm saying to you now. She says, look, I don't pretend that, you know, I can give you a rigorous scientific argument for why this worked, but in fact it did work.
What are we supposed to take from that, though? I mean, it's wild.
Well, I mean, I think there are readers who will take that it worked because I had a psychosomatic condition, right? Like that's, that is one interpretation. I mean, my baseline interpretation is that there are a lot of things you can do to your body that don't fall within the current range of scientific treatments, that nonetheless, if we studied them, like I don't think this was a mystical box. I think this, I think this had an effect in the physical world on physical things inside my physical body. And I think that a number of the things that I did that were strange and weird, including putting magnets on my body, or having a chiropractor do it, also probably fall into those categories. That there are things you can do, and again, there is some tentative evidence along these lines about, you know, that electromagnetism has effects on cancer, right? There are sort of, there's sort of hints in these directions, and then there are a lot of people conducting a lot of experiments. And the weirdest thing about the Rife machine, right, is that it comes with a book. You buy it it comes with a book that is filled with frequencies. The machine generates frequencies, generates thousands of different frequencies. And the book lists all these illnesses that you could do this frequency for, bubonic plague. Right.
Sounds like a Dr. Bronner soap.
Bronner.
Right. Well, you're not sure, right? You're not. And look, and I have not. If I were probably a better journalist, I would have absolutely gotten to the bottom of this. But it's not clear looking at it. You know, is this really something that some, traveling medicine show guy, did he sit down and just use a random number generator to pretend these frequencies? Or with Lyme disease, you can actually see how they're generated. You go on Lyme disease message boards and you see people saying, well, I tried frequency 870.6 for this, and it really seemed to work. So some of them are being generated by people experimenting with the machines. I don't know where the listed frequency for, Gardnerella, right? Or I mean, these things you've never heard of. Well, since we're on video. Hang on.
Love it. I love it.
If you're on audio, understand he's bringing
I'm holding
book out.
This is the book.
Book.
It's in my. I don't use the machine that much anymore, but we're recording this in my attic, and so, gout, gonorrhea, Graves' disease.
You never know.
Fever, headaches due to parasites, headaches caused by vertebral misalignment. Anyway, one of these days, Rod, you will come to Connecticut and come to my attic, and we will do a live show of your podcast hooked up to my Rife
That'll
machine.
Be fun.
That'll be great. That'd be great. I have one question. I'm sorry. I know we're tight on time, but Ross, I just want to know. I'll be fast. Were you ever tempted in the midst of this real pain that was chronic and you fought, daily as you talk about in the book? That it altered your thinking, your sort of philosophical grounding, like that it changed you intellectually?
Yes, I think it definitely made me much more radically open-minded. And look, to start with, I'm a Roman Catholic whose parents spoke in tongues when I was a kid, right? So
as Pentecostals,
right? So by the standards of the secular world, I'm already considered, so radically open-minded that my brain is falling out, right? So from a certain perspective, maybe I didn't change that much, but from my own perspective, yeah, I mean, I found things that helped me treat a condition that, the official medical system is not sure is really a condition at all. And I found some of them from outside the mainstream doctors, and I found some of them from things outside the mainstream of outside the mainstream, right? Like two levels out.
Yeah.
And that can't help but change you. Now, it happened at a time when, I think the world has become a bit more radically open-minded, right? So, if I were to say, well, it made me more likely to think that, COVID-19 could have leaked out of a lab, or that, UFOs could be among us. Those would have been radical ideas a few years ago, but now everyone's like, oh, sure, the UFOs are among us, and COVID probably leaked from a lab. So it may be that my increasing open-mindedness / insanity is just, I'm just participating in a broader, world spirit transformation as we go deeper into the age of Aquarius. Who can say?
Well,
yeah,
I have to.
You're not insane. I mean, I was just going to say, I mean, with all of your deprecating humor aside, I mean, you're not insane though. I mean, I think that's what's
I'm not insane, but it is important to always concede the simplest reading of certain things that I'm offering to the world in this book. So
now your timing on this book is just phenomenal because of COVID. You started this book before COVID, and all of this stuff happened to you before COVID, but this stuff, the story you tell in the book is so relevant to the things that we're all going through in the age of COVID, not only these mysterious diseases, but and how you're telling in the last chapter about what happened at the Plum Island National Laboratory, and how, I mean, it makes a lot of sense as we're sitting here reading on our laptops about how actually the government did pay for gain of function research at the Wuhan lab on how to weaponize bat viruses. Well, you found out that there is solid evidence that there was research being done at this laboratory near Old Lyme, Connecticut, where Lyme disease was first, identified. There was research going on there on tick-borne illnesses.
Yes, I mean, I want to stress, I didn't find out anything
that
wasn't already known, right? And there isn't. So yeah, the epicenter of the East Coast outbreak of Lyme disease is this area that is very close to a biowarfare facility in the Long Island Sound. And honestly, as someone who grew up in Connecticut, just the fact that there's a biowarfare facility in the freaking Long Island Sound is kind of mind-blowing. But there is not. I want to be clear. There is not any evidence that we have that Lyme disease specifically and deer tick specifically were worked on at Plum Island. Now, that doesn't mean it didn't necessarily happen, but there's no sort of smoking gun about Plum Island. And there are some reasons to think that this wasn't the source of the outbreak, because there is a Midwestern form of Lyme disease that sort of followed a similar pattern of growth in the 1970s that seemed to be driven by just suburbanization, people moving into forests, coming in contact with deer. So this is not like the Wuhan outbreak where you have like this disease that didn't exist before and now you're trying to explain it. Like you can explain Lyme disease without the conspiracy theory, but still it's not even a conspiracy theory like the Wuhan theory. It's a lab leak theory. It's not a conspiracy. It would just be an accident. But it is right across the Sound from Old Lyme. It's like it's right there. You can see. Crazy. I took a ferry from Long Island to New London, and you go right by the biowarfare laboratory. So yeah, and so I'm right. In a previous life, I would have been more likely to simply reject that hypothesis. And in this life, I present it in the spirit of agnosticism and open-mindedness, I guess you could say. Guys, I got to go, unfortunately.
All right. Well, thank you so much for being on here with us, Ross. It's great. Your book, The Deep Places, fantastic. It drops this week. So by the time our listeners hear this, you they can get out there and get your book. And if they get the audio book, they can hear you reading.
That's right. If you've enjoyed my dulcet tones on this podcast, you can also hear them. You can also hear them reading the book. But thank you so much for having me on. And Rod, I want to say especially, you both wrote a blurb for the book and wrote a very, very kind exegesis of it for the American Conservative, and I'm very grateful to your attention to the book. So thank you.
You're very welcome. And I'll sign off by altering my usual sign off a little bit to say, don't get no ticks on you.